So to our first speaker. Matt Keane is the New South Wales Minister for Energy and Environment, a portfolio that was first combined after the Berejiklian government's re-election in March 2019. Minister Keane was elected as the member for Hornsby in 2011 at the age of 29, after working as a chartered accountant and senior manager for PricewaterhouseCoopers. In January 2017, Mr Keane was elevated to Cabinet as the Minister for Innovation and Better Regulation, which he saw as an opportunity to be a champion for the little guy. A passionate advocate for portfolios of energy and environment since 2019, Mr Keane took over this portfolio with great gusto. He wants to ensure the community has access to energy that is affordable and reliable, is a loud proponent of greater action on climate change, and believes the government should help its residents leave the planet in a better state than the one we inherited. So to formally open the summit, please welcome the Minister for Environment and Energy, Matt Keane.
Well, thank you, Lisa. And could I too begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Can I take this opportunity to thank the Sydney Morning Herald for the opportunity to address this Sustainability Summit. The Herald is an important institution in the history and daily life of our state in New South Wales. Its enduring contribution to public debate reflects the commitment of the people who work there and the continued importance of daily newspaper journalism. In a constantly evolving media industry, one thing remains clear to me: the importance of having a vibrant and fearless paper of record, challenging authority and telling the stories of our shared lives. One of those important stories is the sustainability of our lives in this place and how we can do better. And that's why we're all here today. We live in extraordinary times. At the start of 2020, I don't think anyone could have envisaged the disruption we have experienced this year. The coronavirus global pandemic has upended so many aspects of our lives. Managing this global pandemic has forced governments, businesses, and everyone else into uncharted territory. We've never had to live like this before. Few decision makers are in their comfort zone. No leader or government wants to lock down its cities or close its borders. These are difficult choices alien to our idea of a shared, inclusive society. To date, the primary focus of governments in responding to the pandemic has been to protect the public. And as a result, large parts of our engine of economic creativity and prosperity have had to temporarily make way for safety and survival. This has upended financial markets, stalled investment, increased unemployment, and driven some sectors of the economy close to the brink. It is the biggest shock in peacetime since the 1930s. The next and even bigger challenge will be how to rebound the economy from this deep recession, to get New South Wales and the country back to work. The New South Wales government has already recommitted to our $100 billion infrastructure pipeline, established a $3 billion infrastructure and jobs acceleration fund, and allocated almost $16 million to stimulus measures to support the recovery. The New South Wales Treasurer, Dominic Perrottet, has reiterated throughout this pandemic that we will always put people before numbers. We think the most effective pathway out of recession is for government to support investment and job creation. A half-hearted approach to putting the economy back on its feet will only protract the suffering. Now, the truth is that governments in the private sector are going to need to unleash an unprecedented wave of spending to get our economy moving again, to get New South Wales back to work. This is going to see governments borrow huge sums, effectively passing some of this debt onto future generations. If we are going to impose this cost on them, we need to make sure that they will see the benefits. I don't just want to see our children paying interest on our debt. I want to see our children earning returns on our investments. What we decide to spend our nation's wealth on over the next 12 months is going to determine the type of jobs our kids and we are going to have, the living standards that we're going to enjoy, and the environment that we're going to endow to them. In making these decisions, we're at a crossroads. We can either reignite the ideological wars of the past or build a more sustainable future. We could frame our vision through the rearview mirror, focusing on the past decade where fear, division, and scaremongering have driven our nation's agenda. Or we could look forward, use our success in dealing with this crisis to lay a foundation for a new era of transformation, built on a belief that through good ideas, hard work, we can build a better, more sustainable, and more prosperous country. If we want to repay future generations with interest, then we should borrow to start rebuilding them a low-carbon world today. Now, we know the rest of the world is moving on climate change. In fact, more than half the world's GDP is created in jurisdictions that have signed up to deliver net zero emissions by 2050. We're seeing some of the world's leading companies, like Volkswagen, Apple, who you'll hear from later today, and BHP, commit to not only achieving net zero emissions in their own business activities, but also commit to reduce the emissions of their suppliers and their products as well. And even big oil and gas companies, who've profited from extracting fossil fuels for decades, are planning for life beyond carbon, moving to decarbonise their businesses. Now, decarbonising the economy is going to require a redesign of most sectors within it. Energy supply and industrial processes, the cars, trucks and buses we move in, and the houses and buildings that we live and work in. It will change agriculture and land management. We will need to rethink how we manage risk in some increasingly bushfire-prone regions. And so does the rest of the world. That's not only tackling huge challenges, it's going to create enormous opportunities. We've already seen Tesla, a company that was nowhere a decade ago, become the most valuable car company in America's history. There are also real risks. There are many ways we can get this wrong. If we don't move at all, if we move too slowly, or we head in the wrong direction, then New South Wales and Australia could find itself on the wrong side of megatrends like rising carbon-based protectionism, while other economies steal our march in new clean technologies and industries. There is a real risk that we become a rust bucket state. Now, we should be using this recovery to build a low-carbon economy, not just because it's good for the environment, but because it's good for the state, the country, and the kind of economy that our kids will prosper from. Now, this is not just wishful thinking. The International Monetary Fund and the International Energy Agency have recently joined forces in the post-COVID environment to develop a sustainable recovery plan. In their words, it is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reboot economies, create a wave of new jobs, whilst accelerating a shift to a decarbonised future. Their plan focuses on how government spending over the next 3 years can maximise growth, create jobs, and deliver sustainable development goals. Now, today I'm proud to be releasing the Chief Scientist report into the opportunities for New South Wales in a low-carbon economy. The Chief Scientist has identified 65 economic opportunities across key sectors of the state's economy, including services, energy, industry, the built environment, land management, and transport. There are many great ideas in the report, too many to mention them all here today, so I'll flag a few now and invite you to read the report in your own time. I'd like to briefly highlight 3 areas: green chemicals, hydrogen, and agriculture. Firstly, green chemicals. The idea of carbon capture was originally adapted from technologies used in the oil and gas industries to push hydrocarbons out of underground reserves by pumping in carbon dioxide. The idea to store this was to do this without the resource extraction, to capture and store the greenhouse gas underground where it had no impact on the atmosphere. Carbon capture and storage works. The challenge is the the cost. It consumes a lot of energy and requires proximate geological storage. The chief scientist has taken this idea a step further, suggesting we look at using the captured carbon dioxide as an input to manufacture chemicals like ammonia, magnesium carbonate used in fertilisers, and even carbon-neutral fuels, with the potential to tap into multi-billion-dollar global markets. On the topic of agriculture, the report also identified enormous opportunities for regional New South Wales through increased sequestration of greenhouse gases from land management, development of lower emissions livestock, and developing markets for a range of sustainably branded products. Now, the National Farmers Federation is currently developing a farm biodiversity certification scheme, one of a number of evolving certification systems in the sector. Carbon farming in New South Wales has the potential to earn from $11 to $24 billion by 2030, simply by adapting existing land uses to maximise the amount of carbon stored in vegetation and soils. The report also identifies opportunities to use gene technologies and synthetic biology to create climate change resistant crops, resistance to disease, reduced pesticide use, and increased yields. By developing feed supplements to reduce emissions from livestock, New South Wales could develop a competitive advantage in high value-add consumer markets. Finally, to hydrogen. The clean tech buzzword of 2020 is hydrogen. Hydrogen has been around for a century, used to refine steel and other metals. It was also used to power the Saturn V rockets that sent man to the moon, while the first hydrogen fuel cells provided electricity and fresh water to the astronauts. The spectacular fall in cost of renewable generation has rapidly accelerated the potential for hydrogen to play a critical role in our decarbonised future. Hydrogen can be produced by electrolysing water with electricity. If this process can get cheap enough, then abundant and cheap renewable energy can be used to make abundant and cheap hydrogen. This green hydrogen can then be stored and used as a fuel to firm renewables. The green hydrogen used to firm renewables in electricity and combusted to provide zero emissions, high temperature heat for industrial processes like steel and cement making. It could power trucks, buses, cars, ships and trains. Hydrogen is to climate change what a vaccine is to COVID-19. Put simply, a breakthrough that changes the world. Now, the key opportunities in low carbon are highly interdependent, and most link back to energy. Australia has some of the most abundant and lowest cost renewable energy in the world, and so is well placed to convert this into low-cost green hydrogen. That is why during this crisis, I was so proud to announce nearly $110 million to develop the country's first coordinated renewable energy zones in the Central West and New England. Renewable energy zones are a modern-day power station which will provide the state with the clean, cheap electricity needed to make the most of these opportunities that the chief scientist has identified. New South Wales also has a number of locations that could become hydrogen hubs to store and export the fuel. We shouldn't kid ourselves. There is a ferocious global research and investment going on into all parts of the hydrogen supply chain. It is essential that we're in the pack and ready to make the most of the commercial opportunities if and when they arrive. There is a global arms race going on to get first to develop these clean energy technologies. So what does a successful, sustainable recovery look like? The clues are in today's report. Maybe borrowing to fast-track new hydrogen projects, a new low-emissions industrial precincts and new low-emissions industrial precincts, to start removing the barriers to electrification of cars with a strategic rollout of EV chargers right around the state, to work with our major industries to help them transition manufacturing to low-emissions processes, to getting physical and system changes in regions to start generating multi-billion-dollar incomes from carbon farming, to building the renewable energy zones to power the economy of the future. Of course, a low-carbon recovery is not only good for our economy, it's also necessary to protect our way of life. Last summer's bushfires showed us an Australia none of us want to see. An Australia where countless regional communities feared for their safety, the safety of their families and loved ones, and for their homes. Over the summer we saw Sydney, the nation's most famous city, shrouded in smoke, where we couldn't enjoy our harbour and beaches. This is not the Australian way of life. This is not the way of life our parents enjoyed. And this is not the way of life any of us want to leave to our kids. The recent bushfire showed exactly what the scientists warned us would happen. Hotter, drier summers, more extreme weather events leading to things like catastrophic bushfires. In fact, over the past 30 years, the scientific consensus on the science around climate change has consolidated. It is real, and it's happening right now. In the inquiry into the recent catastrophic bushfires in New South Wales, the former chief scientist, Mary Keane, said that climate change clearly played a role in creating the conditions that led to the fires, and that we should expect conditions like that or worse in the future. To ignore the threat of climate change or to continue to defer decisive action into the future is counterintuitive till we know what we've seen has worked. To mitigate this risk, we need to reach net zero emissions by 2050. The coronavirus pandemic is the first major crisis our country has faced in the 21st century. I think we're up to the challenge. It is during difficult times that the cream rises to the top. The way New South Wales has handled this pandemic is the envy of the world. Now, we've had some luck, but our track record is firmly based on Gladys's focus on making decisions based on science and expert advice. No leader in the world, no leader anywhere in the world has handled this crisis better than Gladys Berejiklian. Gladys is famous for her work ethic, humility, attention to detail, and intelligence. Our success has also been based on the efforts of the Australian people. We have taken a typically Australian approach to this crisis. We've made practical decisions based on the facts in front of us. We've worked hard to keep our businesses going and our children's education continuing. And we've made sacrifices to our personal freedoms to keep others from getting sick. We now have an imperative for urgent economic repair, multi-billion-dollar spending to rebuild the economy. That provides an opportunity to transform New South Wales and our country into a smarter, cleaner, more durable and more future-focused place, one that can make the most of its new competitive advantages in a rapidly changing world. After the Second World War, our ancestors had to rebuild the nation following the great challenge of their generation. They didn't try to recreate life as it was before the war. They imagined a world that was fairer, peaceful, and more prosperous. They helped take us to the moon. They cured disease, and they lifted millions out of poverty. Theirs was a generation that rose to the challenge of the times. Now is the time for our generation to do exactly the same.
Thanks, Matt. We've just got time for a couple of questions from our audience, actually. Thanks so much for sending them in. The New South Wales Government is now taking the lead on responsible environmental management. Given the states are dependent on the federal government for funding, how long can this last?
Well, the Commonwealth Government has provided New South Wales with the opportunity to take advantage of the opportunities that will emerge in a low-carbon world. We signed a memorandum of understanding with the Commonwealth Government, which will see $3 billion injected into New South Wales to help us transition our grid away from old forms of generation to newer technologies. It will help us build the transmission lines and the storage that will deliver that low-cost energy into the system that can catalyse, not only deliver lower bills for families and businesses in New South Wales, but catalyse the development of new industries, new jobs that will underwrite our prosperity for generations to come. So we're working constructively with the Commonwealth to make sure that we deliver the best outcomes for New South Wales and enable us to take advantage of the opportunities that are emerging in a low-carbon world.
You and the Berejiklian government has been very clear about their targets for 2050. Do you think the federal government needs to jump on board and do the same?
Well, if you don't have a goal, you won't be able to get there. New South Wales has a very clear goal. We want to get to zero net emissions by 2050, and we've set a concrete target of a 35% emissions reduction by 2030. Now, the reason we've done that is not only to focus government, but to focus the community, to focus business, to focus capital in achieving that goal that we know is necessary not just for our environment, but we know it's going to be critical to ensure that our economy and our living standards remain high as the world transitions to a low-carbon world. So I think you do need a target. I think you do need to know where you're headed if you want to achieve it. So we've got that in New South Wales, and I'll work with anyone at the state levels, at the federal levels, that wants to join us in hitting net zero emissions, not just for our environment, but for the future of our economy.
And final question from Philip Bateman. He says, your speech sounds like a fantastical, logical and semi-obvious rollout plan. Is this posed as an adjunct or an alternative to the gas-led recovery? And is there any way to make this happen at a national level?
Well, New South Wales, my job as the New South Wales Minister for Energy is to make sure we're focused on delivering cheaper energy for the families and businesses of New South Wales. The best way to do that is to move towards a renewable future. Why? Because of the economics. The cheapest way to deliver electricity today is wind, sun, backed up by pumped hydro and battery storage. That is killing the economics of gas, of coal, and certainly for those people that are in love with nuclear, nuclear doesn't even come close to what we can deliver. So if you want cheaper electricity for families and businesses, if you want to make sure that we've got low energy prices and you can catalyse the development of energy-intensive industry here, creating thousands of jobs, underwriting our prosperity for the future as the world moves towards net zero emissions, then you need to move towards renewables. Now, gas may have a role to play over a short time period, but it's going to pretty quickly become a white elephant because of the economics around renewables. That's the reality. We should be making decisions based on the economics, on the science, and on expert advice. And on all three of those criteria, it's a renewables future for New South Wales and indeed the country, not other forms of generation.
Great. Well, I think we're out of time, so I really appreciate you joining us. Please thank Minister Keane.